and digesting everything together. But first, like I said, I wanted to just start by sharing a few moments from the entire experience. So with the fellowship in its kickoff in DC a few weeks ago, what ended up happening was that on the first day, which was a Thursday, they brought all 6, not 5, 6 fellows together for our own orientation, to get familiar with the Kennedy Center, its values, JFK's values, and there are 5 main ones. I will not try to iterate those to you, but there are 5 main ones. One is gratitude, one is justice, one is service. There are 2 others. And as you can see, one of the things that I learned about our cohort throughout this process was, one, the age that they targeted. Everyone is like late 20s, mid 30s. I think the oldest person, who's Hakeem in the top right, he's 38. They're definitely targeted a certain age demographic, but in regards of race, gender, expression, sexuality, it's all across a different gamut. And within our disciplines as well, only 3 of us on the bottom, we're all visual artists. Myself as a designer, Michelle, who's in the middle in the red pants, she's a muralist from Philly. Artist bringing and visualizing the voices of Latinx as well as indigenous women who have made history and impact, whose stories are not being shared within history books and within our common culture. On the bottom right is Akane, and he's an artist who is from I don't know which country in Africa, but he is from the continent of Africa and has lived in the US most of his life, and he's a technologist. So he uses tech, digital software, all of that type of stuff in order to get people to change their behaviors in public. And a lot of that unveils itself in alignment with a lot of social issues, most specifically for him, immigration. And then everyone at the top are all spoken word artists and classical instrumentalists. And so a little bit of performing, a little bit visual, a little bit tech, and beyond. In addition to touring the space, which I was telling some people about, like just how blown away all of us were of being tiny humans in a space like the Kennedy Center, we also got to meet YoYo Ma, finally for the first time in person. And one of the big joys of that part of the experience was really the humanizing of himself. Like everyone sees this big name, this figure, and it was humbling to know that he doesn't have it figured out. Like part of why he's interested in connecting with so many artists around the nation in particular is that no one that he's talked to can figure out how can we really disrupt political power and policy. And so he's looking at people from different parts of the nation. All of us represent different regions. Of course, I'm Midwest. In order to learn from hyperlocal examples of people who are not only artists, but also connectors to community in order to figure out collectively what can we do. So after the first day of all of that, there was an art summit the rest of the weekend, explosive performances by a lot of amazing artists. Condoleezza Rice was there. On a political level, I haven't always been the biggest Condoleezza Rice fan, but she's a pianist and she is really good. So darn good at it. And there was this panel there were a lot of panels and conversations, but in each one of them, they made sure that they brought in not only artists, but psychologists, neurologists, There was a astronomer in one of the conversations with a business leader and a politician in order to really model what does it look like when we get these radically different industries to the same subject together, and what are the ideas that unfold from there. And so that was part of the experience. Everyone got to bring a friend with them or a spouse. You all may recognize this person, Mallory Nizam, fellow artivist, fellow citizen artist from St. Louis. She now lives in DC. And it was just great to have someone else from our city be a part of that. So going back to that question of what is a citizen artist? For myself, entering into this definition of that, like, then was something hard for me to adapt. I even think now, like, saying that I'm a citizen artist is something that doesn't sound right for me. Community artist, community-based, socially engaged, all of those terms, but enter in it with a lot of skepticism about what it would mean. And so I thought that I would share these 2 short videos. Some of the people from the summit share their own thoughts on it.
There's so many ways of looking at art history. For me, citizen art history is when you come up with an essential truth, communicate and resonates with other people. Do your work right. You're extending someone's ability to think in a way that gives you a greater perspective of your enemy now.
A citizen artist is an artist that uses their personal experience to tell their story and then find commonalities in the people that they're telling their story to and using those to unify people.
Younger people see things in the first experience of the world. We actually need them to help make our communities and our country stronger, more creative, and filled with purpose. It's possible and maybe really valuable for artists to also think about what is your responsibility to actually help the rest of us understand where we are in our society or in our culture. Give me a focused perspective so that I go back to whatever I do and do it with greater hope and greater possibilities.
Oops, I'm gonna play one more. I'm gonna start it here.
Citizen University is about really trying to foster a culture of powerful citizenship. It's worth taking a moment just to say, when we say citizenship, as we've been saying all day here, I don't mean documentation status under the immigration and naturalization laws of the United States. I mean membership in the body. A sense of being a contributor to this common endeavor. And it's in that spirit that I want to share these 3 on our day as a segue into our calls to action.
So I'll stop that one there. As you can see, it's 30 minutes long. I will spare you. But I wanted to add in this perspective. And this person, his name is Eric Liu. As he mentioned in the beginning of this clip, he leads this organization called Citizen University that trains and equips people with different tools, like access to leadership and funding, in order to make ideas happen in their communities, in order to help people attain more political power, in order to change and disrupt policy and culture. And he was one of the main people engaging with us throughout the fellowship and the summit as a mentor. And he has this book called You Are More Powerful Than You Think. And it was from this moment of meeting him, and this was an iteration of some things on Thursday when we met him, and how do we harness that as about what does it mean to be a citizen artist, I draw from these two notes, direct quotes that I heard from both of them in the summit, of the point of citizenship is to enact justice, and that the moral imagination of artists drafts the blueprint for justice, that we have a foundational role in helping ourselves and the people around us who are engaged in our lives and our communities to be able to imagine what a more equitable society looks like. I have some conflict with this notion of being the blueprint in the sense that it's not just us, it's us in collection or collectivity and collaboration with other people, especially people who are living and breathing all of these issues day in and day out. And so one of the main questions that we kept being prompted and asked throughout this entire kickoff to this fellowship was, what can we do together that we can't do alone? And with breaking that down, like the what policies can we create? Can we disrupt? Can we help rewrite? How can we shift things? How can we take over space, reclaim space and voice and narratives? What types of works can we actually, as individuals and groups and people, I'll put in St. Louis, but beyond our own geography, fix, disrupt, model that they put into action during that summit, of not just thinking about the common denominators of civic organizations and nonprofits, but really thinking, well, if we're trying to change transportation systems, well, why not reach out to someone super random and unlikely, like a NASCAR driver? Like, what perspective can they add to the civic institutions that are working on transportation and the artists that may be engaging in those types of spaces? That's a very random example, but it was something that led us to think about power in a more it became defined that power is the capacity to ensure that people do what you want them to do. That definition. Exactly. Any other thoughts on that?
It's contingent upon other people.
It's coercive.
Yeah, to ensure.
Right.
It's the word that I found.
So with learning this definition, these were all the concerns and like discomforts that many of us had about it too. And with all of these points, I don't think any of them are the rule. They're perspectives, they're opinions, but these are the things that I've come back challenging within my own head, but also wanting to pose and pick apart and really reflect on that, power is about capacity, that power ensures, like that, as Carly said, power has to be conditional upon who it's in relationship to, that perhaps it's not innate. I think that power is innate. But we went with it, explained it. He was like, just listen to it for this particular point of stripping down all the nuances and getting like directly to the denotation that power is about influence.
What would happen if you have a hypothesis and you set out to prove it or disprove it, and your experiment, you don't really get the desired results, So then you shift power and you do something a little bit different to force it to have a certain, because in the
Right.
meantime, you're just expending a lot of unnecessary energy and wasting time and resources.
And you're assuming that that like only one entity has power,
Right.
by heralding it as the main source of it. And so how do you create structures within ourselves in the ways that we create groups and orgs where there is more equity of power, there's less hierarchy and less ego within the process at large. So I'm not completely sold on this definition, but it was broken down in another session to this notion of the 7 types of currency, that power is related to currency, and that disturbed me too. And so I changed it to like 7 types of catalysts, like influential things. But going back to this notion, have you all ever heard of this? Like, could you name the 7 types of currency or capital? So I'd heard of it before, thought about it. These, 6. There's a 7th one that is financial. In an ideal world, you would think that everyone owns power in these 7 ways of thinking about social capital, intellectual power and influence, political influence, having the natural environment, i.e. owning land, having buildings and access to space, aka the built capital, having skills and passions and ideas, i.e. the individual. And we all had to do these assessments of how we saw these 7 things working out for ourselves. And for most of us, it looked a little bit like this, where, because we're on social media and stuff, and we have good networks and friends and support systems, most people had a lot of social capital. We had connections. With the demographics of who we all were in this particular cohort, intellectual capital was there. So was individual skills and stuff. But when it came down to the other 4, financial, and then especially political, natural, and built, none of us had that. We're like, yeah, I make money. I'm not like struggling every day, but I can't really influence much financially. Or, yeah, I know about public spaces. I've hosted things inside of buildings, but I don't own anything myself. So how is that power? And the person who was had us think about these 2 questions. If you could inherit any one of these from your grandparents, and if you could give any one of these to your grandchildren, what would that look like? And that was like the most emotional part of our experience, because as you saw from that earlier picture, most of us are people of color. 5 out of the 6 of us are people of color. And much of this from our grandparents. None of us got land or had political impact and influence from our grandparents. We got social capital. We got, individual skills and cultural norms. So there's this exercise where we had to think about these 2 questions and what would we give? And a lot of people said, I would still, even though I didn't get this type of power from my folks, I would still give my kids, my grandkids, the intellectual, the individual stuff, and trust that like through our interactions together, they can earn and gain these other things. And that was challenged as the conversation unfolded about race and systemic injustice and inequities, that even with being great or influential as an individual, there are still systems that we have to break down in order to ensure all of this for other people and for our grandchildren. And so it related back to not only harnessing power in ourselves and our family units, but within our communities. And so I pose this question to you all. If we could center any of these 7 types of capital or currency in our community, which ones or which one is like most crucial right now for us? Not in DC, but here.
I would guess built,
Built?
or just having ownership over our own property
Mm-hmm.
and what we exist in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Oh, I wasn't sure if that was built or natural, but kind of the same thing. Just being able to own property, especially in time when St. Louis is talking about development projects and
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I think with St. Louis's history of geography and ownership and gentrification, I think land makes a lot of sense for St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
I'd have to insert my bias, which is the natural environment that we need to collectively appreciate what we have in the water and public lands around here. And also because water and clean air are so threatened right now, and that will affect all of us if we don't appreciate and protect the benefits that we have so richly in this region and share them equitably.
I may be reading the question slightly differently, but I think what I would think is that people a lot of times have their own unique skill sets and perspectives, and that individual kind of resource is often kind of discarded or not allowed to grow. So I thought about like what you to center that, and so I think that could really help grow a lot.
Good. Any final thoughts on that one? Something, oh, sorry, go for
I
it.
was surprised that nobody said political, especially with the citizen artists bringing and understanding the way that St. Louis's politics feel really systemic themselves and trickle out into built environment, trickle out into what kind of social capital is able to be enacted in our city spaces and public space.
Yeah, I would say political too.
Yeah. I think all of them are valuable. Like we need all of these. So I don't think there's like any right or wrong way of perceiving it. I think it becomes more of a, yes, if we start with built or natural or political or social, how do we get to that, like the social and, the built and really weave all of them together in a way that still gets us to that point of making sure that power is shared, that access, that ownership is all equitable. So of course, with thinking about the citizen artists and all of that, one of the big reflection points became, well, how does art and culture fit into all of this? And how does that happen in a way where artistic and creative experiences and works are not just commodities, but also, or instead of, in some cases, are actually the catalysts themselves, are the drivers of these values. And how does that then shift what we prioritize? We didn't get to any answers on that. So that is just one to keep thinking about. Like, these are things that I posed all of these questions that I came back with you all so that we can think about this collectively, because these are really hard questions. Because even in this case of having this chart, in the corner here, I think part of the assumption is that we either put art in the center, you know, and say that, yeah, we can make a mural about shifting political capital, or have a visual campaign that goes out into nature to bring up awareness. But what does it look like when art becomes that thing itself? A metaphor or like pushback to it. What does it look like when these things can't happen without art and culture involved? As we see in our political landscape, when it's time to make evaluation of within our systems and in our municipalities, the first thing that's cut often are arts and culture. We as artists, as art administrators, ensure that they stay central and core and integrated in all of these facets of how we're perceiving value and power. So no answers, but another big question. So in terms of culture, like there were all these topics that we just kept engaging, like culture, courage, freedom, justice, all of those. But this is another one from the experience that, like that definition of power, struck me with a lot of challenges. That collective memory of a people and what has happened to them. And that what endures most from a society is the culture of its people. I really believe some of this. But I think I think I need to process it more, you know? It's like, I don't fully understand this definition. With you all just reading it, you know, for the first time, does it make sense?
No.
I see a head yes, I see a no. No.
Because I'm trying to figure out how culture is defined as something that has happened to a group of people, when culture can be created within a group of people.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't feel active enough.
Right, it makes it seem as though everything is completely environmental in regards to what builds a culture, when a lot of it is very intellectual and emotional.
Mm-hmm.
Or that it's like whoever is holding that power is the one determining the entire culture, right?
I think also with that, oftentimes, it's the mainstream that determines what is a culture, but also what are cultural assets versus the underground or the margins. And I agree with Tasha a bit of this whole notion of what has happened to them. I get where it's coming from, of like history, like what has happened amongst them or within them across time. That notion of imposing that this is a body of folks that hasn't had power. And I'm just a firm believer that we all have it. It's just a matter of like recognizing, owning, actualizing it. But I saw your face, Nick, as a head nod that you get it.
Yeah, I think that's a whole completely big thing. I would just say, like, I can speak from my cultural heritage. I think, like, you know, we're conquering us, and we took that on. Reaction, like, could have potentially been a lot of things, but I interpret that to mean like what happened to us and then how we naturally reacted given where we were.
It's patterns. I think because the collective memory, if people congregate and they see each other often enough, they can spark conversation and share similarities and patterns and things that happen to shape a culture or environment that they live in. And if it doesn't suit them, they see it's not productive, then they move on typically to someplace that they connect to, fit in, or thrive.
Yeah. As you can see, we were engaging in a lot of heavy conversations, like heady things, like a little bit above my own maturation of thought, where I'm still processing a lot of it, and not necessarily agreeing with a lot of it in many ways. But there was this one part of the experience especially on that first day, as we first started to unfold power and currency and capital and all of that, where the conversation became more and more about dignity. And this notion or this question of, if we're thinking of power as ensuring that people do what you want them to do, how do you ensure that dignity is an outcome of power? And so they had us digest that a bit, and we came up with, this huge list of what does that look like? What does it feel like to have dignity, to harness power? Some of these are familiar concepts and ideas that some of us have talked about. Injustice, that to have dignity as a people, as a community, centers our resiliency, individually and collectively. But what it looks like is reclaiming a lot of things that have been historically and systemically stripped away or taken away, or not provided in some ways. Things like space and voice, the ability to define who we are for ourselves and tell our own stories. And even in this, 2017, we're still battling with all of these. Things like appropriation and co-opting are still stripping away from certain cultures the lens of the mainstream, the people who are in certain positions of power, to reorient things towards certain demographics over others. But with dignity comes that confidence, that courage to have, in many ways, like the heart. That's where it comes from, to have the heart to actively pursue things. And so one of the things that I posed to everyone was, if we are artists, if we are citizen artists, how do we create the conditions that make these things possible, that assure that we get to this list that I was able to capture and all the other things that we were posing to? But for yourselves, if you had to answer that same question of, how do we ensure that dignity, that pride, that human lives are valued and we don't look down upon others, that we each feel valued and warranted towards having the best that our lives can offer, what else would you add to this list?
I think that I would have to redefine power, because if this is what we think of as dignity and having individual power, the definition that was brought up before can't exist together. Have all these things where, influencing over other people.
Much about influencing what others do.
Maybe for everybody, they don't go together.
I don't think anyone brought that up. That's awesome.
I personally tackle that dissonance with the overarching method of nonviolence as a way of coercion. It's nonviolent coercion, so honoring personal dignity and the dignity of an oppressor as a method.
Just more things to think about. I have no answers to any of this stuff, but I did want to, especially with consideration of our time together, to pull all of this together with that big question that I told you at the beginning, we kept being asked, what can we do together that we can't do alone? Is I can do all 7. The financial, social, individual, intellectual, built and natural assets and resources that we have amongst ourselves shift the conditions, the structures that continue to keep us in a cycle of, or keep us and others in these cycles of oppression and suppression and struggle. It's a big loaded question. You're like, this is heavy. Yeah.
So one thing that I keep thinking about, and I always feel annoying bringing up, but for me, one of the things that I feel like was missing from the list was like capitalism, or like anti-capitalism, or like building a space outside of that. That's something we can't do alone, certainly. And also when I think about power, kind of across communities, that's something that ties a lot of them together. Even when we're talking about all the things that you named, when I rationalize why, like, what makes this powerful versus this one, a lot of times it comes down to money. And I definitely do think that like capitalism obviously works with a lot of other things at the same time, but when we're talking about power and what artists can do, and something that I see happening in St. Louis already is the idea of the collective challenging, associating value and power with money. And that's something I think that you literally cannot do alone, right? Like you can't buck a system that we're all involved in, because we have to depend on it alone. I think that's happening in small ways already in St. Louis, right? Like,
Yeah.
in a ton of different ways, but that's something that I didn't see up there.
Good point. I'm trying to think of the 2 groups that I know of. Solidarity Economy, and Cowrie. Yeah, Cowrie Collective. We're here to speak on that even more.
Because the idea of artists, like doing artist exchanges, right? Like it's like a very small thing, right? But like the idea of like, I can give you this piece of art for your piece of art, or I can give you this piece of art for like whatever, which is like the basis of Cowrie Collective in a lot of ways. It's like a trade sort of. But I think that like is a small scale thing, example of what larger scale. Just because I do think that capitalism is one of the things that is like the underseat of power that a lot of people don't.
I wonder if though sometimes how much of it is like we put our mental energy into it. You know, like we invest in it all the time. Like even when you talk about like communities that it's clearly screwing over, like the first thing that they're thinking is I need money. And it's not to blame them for that situation because it's a natural reaction, but I think when you talk about creating some of those systems, that's where I think like the artists can really come in to envision something and then get people like whether it's Cowrie Collective or Solidarity Economy, but just try it and start investing in something new and build it. Black Panthers did it and it was very effective.
Any other thoughts?
I would say what you've been doing with helping kids design, choose the problem, design the solution, and enact it. It's very empowering, and that's something that probably harder to do one-on-one with the kids, but with a group of kids, then they have a sense of doing it together, and that you don't have to be a branded artist to be creative and problem solve in your own community.
Yeah. One of the things that I have seen be valuable in that process, and I'm thinking back to one of my favorite examples is the collaboration that I did with Regina Martinez at the Pink House for much of 2013 going into 2014, of young people literally answering the question of like, what pisses you off in your neighborhood, and coming to their own conclusions about that, researching that themselves, and building something, and how in that process there are skills that are learned. And so by teaching, by training, that gets us to that individual like asset that we're trying to cultivate. And that also becomes a matter of scale. Like, how do you scale those types of efforts? Because that was not like a perfect project by any means. And get to the point where this notion of Skillshare. Have you all heard of the org Skillshare, where literally if you know how to do anything, you can go onto this platform, open up your laptop, teach other people how to do what you do. And it's one way of generating income. So still in that, that financial dependency upon an exchange of money. But what happens is an exchange of skills and connections and resources in other ways. And so I think any way that we can integrate more skill sharing into artistic practices, into the ways that we engage even in like gallery spaces, that could be influential. Like, what does it look like to have a cohort of young artists working with a veteran artist or a more mature artist, learning how to hang the show, and then they get their chance to hang their own work? Like, how can we disrupt our own ways of behaving and our norms in order to integrate that more into practice? Any other thoughts on this big question? This is one that I think I'll keep posing to myself and to others, of like, and I think for me it's more so in the framing of like, don't let me do this alone. Like, I don't want you to do that alone. And oftentimes, like, the buzzword is collaboration, but how do we really adopt that sense of loving and supporting each other in order to show up for each other, in order to help crazy ideas happen, in order to be fearless in the ways that we disrupt. It's like we all talk about, well, not all, many of us talk about these super radical ideas. How do we make sure that we're not even thinking about them alone, and leveraging the connections that we're making with people, like these folks like YoYo Ma, in order to make ideas happen? So I was gonna go into like this whole process, but I think we've been doing this process a little bit, even within conversation. But this whole notion, there was a person from the NEA who spoke to us, their own stuff, and I was like, help yourselves. But there was a slide that had these 5 points, and I added a 6th one about respect, that I actually thought was helpful. When we find ourselves using these types of buzzwords, what is it that we really need? And these were the 5 that the representative from the NEA laid out. Was common agenda, shared values in a way of measuring those, activities that reinforce those values, being able to learn with each other and grow with each other through the process, trusting the process, but also harnessing other institutions and resources in order to have support. That I think is essential to a lot of work, is respect. With respect comes trust. And to trust the process, you got to trust the people that you're on the boat with to make sure that it doesn't sink. And so, like, when it comes to power, with myself, I'm still processing, and so I'll continue to share things very likely through Facebook and YouTube. But if you all are interested in continuing some of this conversation about some of these, big concepts and how can we whittle them down into actionable steps, especially as this year continues to unfold with this fellowship, I would love to stay connected and engaged with all of you for that purpose. And then if you're a reader, like I said, Eric Liu, the tiny man, tiny person who was speaking about Citizen University, he wrote this book called You're More Powerful Than You Think. Mallory and I just started reading it. Through reading this book, I'm starting to understand this definition of power. I think so often power is a scary term, is a term that we don't give, I was gonna say healthy connotation, but happy connotation, because it's often associated with corrupt forces and oppressive forces. And part of what this book is opening my mind to think about are the more, in my opinion, more feminist ways of understanding power dynamics, but looking at it from a community-based level. And what does it look like when individuals really put themselves together in order to create this bubble of influence, of shifting things. One of the first examples in the book that he lays out is about these tomato farmers and how they were not treating their land workers right, by not paying them well, by not providing health insurance. And people are literally dying in the tomato fields. And with tomatoes, it's one of those crops where you can't just easily turn to a machine and say, pick the tomatoes. And through just telling their story and getting the story out to other people, and then those people getting access to media, they were able to take down Taco Bell as their first major corporation, and shame Taco Bell for using tomatoes that were being harvested by these farms that were not treating people, humans, right and with dignity. Into McDonald's and then Wendy's and any of these places except for Taco Bell. I do eat Taco Bell, but all of these fast food places actually changed some of their policies in regards of who they would get their produce from. Now, if we can get them to treat their workers better and give fair wages, that would be great. But yeah, that's all I have. You know how to stay in contact with me. Thank you all.